Every empire believes it is different, not just stronger than those that came before it, but fundamentally wiser, more experienced, more disciplined, more aware of history, and therefore protected from it. This belief does not appear at the beginning of power. It appears after power has already worked. No empire rises believing it is invincible. Empires rise believing they are capable. Invincibility comes later. It comes after systems stabilize, after borders expand, after institutions survive their first crisis. Success creates confidence. Confidence creates certainty. And certainty creates blindness. When a system works long enough, it begins to feel natural. When it works even longer, it begins to feel permanent. This is where the illusion begins. Every empire looks at the ruins of the past and draws the same conclusion. They failed because they were flawed. We are not. This conclusion feels rational. It feels earned. After all, empires do not rise by accident. They rise because something functions better than what existed before. Administration becomes more efficient. Military power becomes more organized. Economic systems become more reliable. Early success reinforces belief. Rome did not see itself as lucky. It saw itself as superior. Superior laws, superior discipline, superior structure. And for a long time, Rome was correct. Its roads connected continents. Its legal system outlived generations. Its military adapted faster than its enemies. But Rome's greatest strength slowly became its most dangerous assumption. That strength would always be enough. Roman elites did not imagine collapse. They imagined management. Problems were framed as temporary disruptions. Crises were seen as correctable. Decline was something that happened to others. This is a critical shift. When power stops preparing for failure and starts managing permanence, history changes its role. History stops being a warning and becomes a justification. Rome did not ignore history. It studied it, cataloged it, preserved it. But history was no longer used to ask questions. It was used to confirm answers. The past became proof that Rome was different. This is the first recurring pattern of power. The belief that understanding history creates immunity from it. Power rewards certainty. Those who speak with confidence rise faster. Those who hesitate appear weak. Those who question too deeply slow the system down. Over time, certainty stops being a personal trait and becomes a structural requirement. Leaders are not selected for accuracy, but for decisiveness. Caution begins to look like fear. Doubt begins to resemble disloyalty. Silence becomes survival. As power consolidates, listening decreases. Warnings feel repetitive. Criticism feels hostile. Opposition feels unnecessary. This is not moral failure in the traditional sense. It is not simply corruption or greed. It is a psychological transformation. Power reshapes perception. Distance grows between decision and consequence. Those at the center of power do not experience reality directly. They experience it through layers. Reports replace observation. Summaries replace complexity. Language replaces experience. Bad news travels slowly. Good news accelerates. Over time, leaders stop reacting to reality itself and begin reacting to narratives about reality. This is how power becomes insulated, not by walls or guards, but by belief. As long as systems respond, leaders assume the system is healthy. As long as orders are followed, loyalty is assumed. But obedience is not stability, and silence is not agreement. Empires expand because expansion works. At first, resources increase. Influence grows. Confidence deepens. Expansion reinforces the belief that the system is exceptional. But expansion also increases complexity. More territory requires more administration. More control requires more enforcement. More distance requires more interpretation. Reality becomes layered. Truth must pass through filters before reaching the center. And every filter alters it. This is where power begins to drift, not through collapse, but through distortion. At this stage, failure becomes increasingly difficult to recognize, not because it is absent, but because acknowledging it threatens legitimacy. So failure is reframed. Mistakes become exceptions. Crises become external. Responsibility becomes fragmented. The system itself is never questioned. This is why every empire believes it is different. Because believing otherwise would require change. And change feels dangerous to those who benefit most from stability. By the time doubt becomes unavoidable, the system has already trained itself not to hear it. This is not the end of the story, but it is always the beginning of the same one. Asterisk. What follows this belief is not immediate collapse, but reinforcement. Power does not fail suddenly. It stabilizes itself. Institutions grow thicker. Rules multiply. Procedures expand. On the surface, this looks like maturity. In reality, it is the beginning of rigidity. As systems grow larger, they become harder to adjust. As structures become more complex, they resist correction. This is not because correction is impossible, but because it becomes costly. Every correction threatens credibility. Every admission of error weakens authority. Every change suggests uncertainty. And uncertainty is dangerous in systems built on control. So instead of adapting, power explains. Instead of correcting, it justifies. Instead of listening, it reassures itself. This is how empires drift from reality without noticing. In early stages of power, feedback is direct. Mistakes are visible. Consequences are immediate. But as empires grow, distance increases. Distance between rulers and ruled. Between decisions and outcomes. Between intention and impact. This distance is not geographical. It is informational. Information must travel upward through layers. Each layer filters it, not necessarily out of malice, but out of self-preservation. Bad news threatens careers. Warnings disrupt stability. Contradictions slow momentum. So information is softened. Risks are reframed. Failures are delayed. By the time truth reaches the top, it is no longer urgent. It is manageable. It is contextual. It is survivable. This creates the illusion of control. Leaders believe they understand the system because the system responds. Orders are executed. Reports arrive on time. Statistics appear stable, but responsiveness is not health. A system can respond while it quietly decays. This is the second deep pattern of power. Control replaces understanding. As long as mechanisms function, leaders assume meaning is intact. They mistake obedience for loyalty, silence for agreement, stability for resilience. History shows this pattern repeating across empires, not because leaders were unintelligent, but because intelligence alone does not protect against isolation. Power does not corrupt intelligence. It narrows it. The more responsibility leaders carry, the less margin they believe they have for doubt. At the top, hesitation feels irresponsible. Reflection feels indulgent. Uncertainty feels like risk. So leaders simplify. Complex realities become simplified narratives. Contradictions are resolved into explanations. Ambiguity is removed. This simplification is comforting. It makes the world feel manageable. But reality does not simplify with power. It grows more complex. Empires expand. They accumulate obligations, allies, borders, populations, systems. Each addition requires maintenance. Each maintenance requires resources. Each resource requires extraction. Pressure builds, but pressure is rarely acknowledged. Instead, it is normalized. What was once exceptional becomes routine. What was once warning becomes background noise. This is how decline hides, not in collapse, but in normalization. Rome did not fall when its first problems appeared. It fell when problems became ordinary, when emergency measures became standard policy, when temporary solutions became permanent structures. At that point, collapse was no longer dramatic. It was procedural. The same mechanisms that once ensured strength now ensured fragility. Power continues to function, but flexibility disappears. And without flexibility, adaptation becomes impossible. This is the paradox of mature power. The more stable it appears, the less capable it becomes of change. At this stage, reform feels dangerous. Reform implies that something is wrong, and admitting something is wrong threatens legitimacy. So reform is postponed, deferred, redefined. Instead of addressing causes, power manages symptoms. Instead of questioning direction, it optimizes execution. This creates momentum without reflection. Empires become efficient and moving forward without knowing where they are going. This is not stupidity. It is inertia. Inertia reinforced by success. Every victory becomes evidence that the system still works. Every survival of crisis becomes proof that warnings were exaggerated. This reinforces the belief of exception. This happened before, but not to us. We are different. We are more advanced. At this point, history loses its authority. It is no longer consulted. It is referenced, used selectively, symbolically, conveniently. Lessons that challenge the present are ignored. Lessons that flatter it are celebrated. History becomes confirmation, not instruction. This is why empires repeat mistakes they fully understand. Intellectually. Understanding without humility produces repetition. Knowledge without doubt creates confidence. And confidence without correction leads to inevitability. Collapse does not arrive as surprise to history. It arrives as surprise to those experiencing it, because from inside the system, everything still appears functional. Markets still operate. Institutions still exist. Orders are still obeyed. What disappears first is not power, but awareness. Awareness of fragility. Awareness of limits. Awareness of consequence. This loss is gradual. And because it is gradual, it feels normal. By the time the system recognizes danger, its capacity to respond has already eroded. This is not failure by ignorance. That is failure by confidence. And confidence, once rewarded by power, becomes impossible to surrender. As power matures, its center changes. In the early stages of empire, leaders are close to reality. They see consequences. They feel limits. They experience resistance. But as systems expand, leaders move upward and inward. They enter layers of protection. Protection from chaos. Protection from dissent. Protection from contradiction. This protection feels necessary. Leadership requires focus. Noise must be reduced. Complexity must be managed. But protection has a cost. It creates separation. Over time, leaders no longer interact with reality directly. They interact with representations of reality. Briefings, summaries, reports. Reality becomes mediated. This is where the psychology of power shifts. Leaders stop asking what is happening and start asking how it should be. Interpreted. Information is no longer raw. It is prepared. Prepared to align with expectations. Prepared to avoid disruption. Prepared to maintain stability. Those closest to power learn this quickly. Advisors adapt their language. Officials adjust their tone. Messengers learn which truths are acceptable and which are dangerous. This is not always deliberate deception. Often, it is unconscious. People want to be useful. They want to belong. They want to survive within the system. So they filter. They soften edges. They delay urgency. They frame problems as manageable. This creates an environment where power hears only what it can tolerate. The higher one rises. The more filtered reality becomes. Eventually, leaders believe they are well informed because information never stops arriving. But volume is not clarity. Data accumulates. Statistics grow. Charts multiply. Yet meaning decreases. At this stage, leaders mistake information density for understanding. They believe they see everything because they see so much. In reality, they see less than ever. This is the third pattern of power. Information abundance masking awareness loss. As leaders grow isolated, another transformation occurs. They begin to identify personally with the system. Criticism of policy feels like criticism of character. Opposition to decisions feels like personal attack. This makes reflection difficult. Admitting error no longer threatens position alone. It threatens identity. At this point, leadership becomes defensive, not outwardly aggressive, but inwardly rigid. Flexibility is replaced by consistency. Adaptation is replaced by repetition. Leaders repeat what once worked because it confirms their competence. Past success becomes template, but history shows that success ages. What works under one condition fails under another. Power resists this truth because acknowledging change means acknowledging vulnerability, and vulnerability at the top feels unsafe. So, leaders rely more heavily on trusted circles, inner groups, elite advisors, long-standing allies. These circles grow smaller over time. Diversity of perspective decreases. Agreement increases. This creates the illusion of unity. Consensus feels reassuring. Silence feels like support, but agreement at the top often reflects selection, not truth. Those who disagree leave. Those who warn are sidelined. Those who persist are removed. What remains is harmony without accuracy. This is how elite isolation forms, not through conspiracy, but through convergence. People who think alike remain. Those who do not are filtered out. As this happens, power loses its internal corrective mechanisms. There is no friction, no resistance, no meaningful challenge. Decisions become faster, but less grounded. Confidence increases, while precision declines. At this stage, leaders begin to believe that opposition itself is the problem. Dissent is no longer seen as information. It is seen as obstruction. Criticism is framed as disloyalty. Questioning is framed as weakness. This is dangerous territory. Because power that cannot be questioned cannot correct itself. History shows this pattern repeatedly. As empires mature, their leaders become increasingly certain and increasingly wrong, not because they lack intelligence, but because intelligence without challenge becomes belief. Belief hardens into doctrine. Doctrine resists evidence, and evidence, when ignored, does not disappear. It accumulates. Pressure builds quietly. Failures occur at the edges first. In distant regions, in marginalized systems, in ignored populations, these failures are dismissed as local issues, temporary disruptions, external problems, but they are signals. Signals that the center no longer understands the periphery. This misunderstanding grows. Decisions made at the top produce unintended consequences below. Each consequence requires intervention. Each intervention requires resources. Each resource increases strain. The system grows heavier. And heavy systems resist movement. At this point, leaders feel trapped by their own creation. They must maintain control over something increasingly unmanageable. So control intensifies. Rules tighten. Surveillance expands. Enforcement increases. But control does not restore understanding. It replaces it. Leaders believe that If behavior can be regulated, outcomes can be guaranteed. This belief is comforting. It suggests mastery. Mastery without insight is illusion. History shows that empires do not collapse because leaders lack power. They collapse because leaders mistake power for comprehension. By the time leaders recognize the gap, it is too late. The system has already adapted to avoid correction. This is not the end of the empire, but it is the point where reversal becomes unlikely. From here, power can only continue forward along paths it already knows. And those paths lead not to renewal, but to repetition. As power continues along this path, the structure of the empire begins to change internally. Not in ways that are immediately visible, but in ways that alter how decisions are made. Institutions that once existed to serve reality begin to exist to protect themselves. Processes multiply. Committees expand. Oversight layers increase. On the surface, this looks like responsibility. In practice, it creates diffusion that no one feels fully responsible anymore. Decisions are shared. Authority is fragmented. Accountability becomes unclear. When responsibility is unclear, errors lose ownership. Mistakes do not disappear, but no one carries them. This is how systems learn to absorb failure without learning from it. At this stage, empires become highly efficient at maintaining form while losing substance. Rules are followed. Procedures are respected. Reports are filed, yet outcomes worsen. This contradiction creates tension. Instead of addressing the contradiction, power resolves it rhetorically. Language changes. Failure becomes challenge. Decline becomes transition. Instability becomes adjustment. Words soften reality. This linguistic shift is not cosmetic. It is functional. It allows the system to continue without confronting itself. As language drifts, truth becomes negotiable. Statistics are contextualized. Benchmarks are redefined. Success is measured differently. Nothing is false, but nothing is fully true. This is institutional erosion, not collapse, but thinning. Structures remain standing, but they no longer support weight. At this stage, warning signs increase. Economic strain appears at the margins. Administrative inefficiencies multiply. Social trust begins to erode. But these signs are interpreted through the system's logic. Each issue is treated as isolated. Each failure is localized. Each disruption is compartmentalized. The idea that problems might be connected is avoided. Because connection implies system-wide fault. System-wide fault implies reform. Reform implies vulnerability. So instead, power manages complexity by breaking it into pieces. Departments handle their own crisis. Regions absorb their own failures. Institutions compete rather than coordinate. This fragmentation weakens response capacity. When crises grow larger, coordination becomes essential, but coordination requires trust, and trust has already been eroded. At this point, the empire's strength begins to work against it. Scale amplifies inefficiency. Complexity slows reaction. Distance distorts feedback. Small problems take longer to fix. Large problems take too long. Delays accumulate. What once could be corrected quickly now requires negotiation. Negotiation requires consensus. Consensus requires alignment. Alignment no longer exists. So decisions stall. Not because no one cares, but because no one can move. This paralysis is often misinterpreted as caution or deliberation. In reality, it is systemic exhaustion. The empire has grown too heavy to change direction. At this stage, power often turns inward. Energy once used for expansion is redirected toward preservation. Security increases. Monitoring expands. Controls tighten. The goal is stability, but stability without flexibility creates brittleness. Rigid systems break under pressure. Yet pressure continues to rise. Economic demands increase. Social expectations grow. External competition intensifies. The empire must respond faster with tools designed for slower times. This mismatch produces stress. Leaders respond by accelerating existing methods. More enforcement. More regulation. More oversight. Each measure treats symptoms, not causes. This creates feedback loops. Intervention produces resistance. Resistance justifies further intervention. Over time, coercion replaces consent. Compliance replaces loyalty. The empire still functions. But its foundation changes. What once held it together was shared belief. Now it relies on enforcement. This transition is critical. Belief allows flexibility. Enforcement requires rigidity, and rigidity limits adaptation. At this point, dissent increases, not necessarily in organized opposition, but in disengagement. People withdraw participation. Trust erodes further. Cooperation declines. The system responds with more control. This deepens the cycle. Leaders interpret disengagement as threat. Threat demands response. Response increases pressure. Pressure reduces trust. Trust loss reduces legitimacy. Legitimacy loss requires enforcement. This loop tightens. And as it tightens, options disappear. The empire becomes trapped by the methods it uses to survive. Every action reinforces the structure that prevents renewal. This is how decline accelerates. Without appearing traumatic. There is no single moment of failure. There is accumulation. Each decision makes sense locally. Each response feels justified. But the combined effect is loss of resilience. By this stage, even clear warnings are difficult to act on. The system has lost the ability to coordinate meaningful change. What remains is motion without direction, activity without progress. Power without adaptability. This is the stage where collapse becomes probable. Not inevitable yet, but increasingly difficult to avoid. The empire still believes it is different, because from the inside, collapse does not feel like collapse. It feels like management. Asterisk at this stage, the empire no longer sees decline as a possibility. It sees it as an insult. The idea that the system itself could be failing feels unreasonable, even offensive, because the system has survived so much already. Crises have come and gone. Opposition has been suppressed or absorbed. Warnings have been proven wrong before. Each survival reinforces belief. If collapse were possible, it would have happened already. This is the final illusion of power. The belief in exemption. The belief that history applies to others, but not to us. This belief is not arrogance alone. It is exhaustion. After maintaining control for so long, after managing complexity for generations, the idea of fundamental failure feels unbearable. So power doubles down. It interprets every problem as evidence that more control is needed, more coordination, more enforcement, more oversight. But control cannot replace legitimacy, and enforcement cannot replace belief. The empire continues to function, but its energy changes. What once moved forward with purpose now moves out of necessity. Decisions are no longer about improvement. They are about avoidance, avoiding loss, avoiding instability, avoiding admission. This defensive posture reshapes everything. Innovation slows. Risk-taking disappears. Adaptation becomes rare. The system becomes conservative not in ideology, but in behavior. It protects what exists because it cannot imagine what comes next. At this point, decline is no longer dramatic. It is administrative. Budgets are adjusted. Responsibilities are redefined. Expectations are lowered. Each adjustment feels reasonable. Each compromise feels temporary. but they accumulate. Standards erode. Capacity shrinks. Trust weakens further. The empire still looks powerful from the outside. Symbols remain. Ceremonies continue. Institutions stand. But inside, something essential has changed. The system no longer believes in renewal. It believes in endurance. Endurance replaces ambition. Survival replaces vision. This shift is subtle, but decisive. Empires fall not when they are defeated, but when they stop imagining a future that is meaningfully different from the present. At this stage, history has fully lost its role. It is no longer warning, no longer guide. It becomes narrative. Stories of past greatness are repeated to justify present. Stagnation. Memory replaces analysis. Past is celebrated, so the present does not have to be questioned. This is how repetition completes itself. Empire becomes what it once observed. The patterns it recognized in others are now fully internalized. Centralization without responsiveness. Control without understanding. Stability without resilience. And because these patterns feel familiar, they feel safe. By now, collapse is not a single event. It is a process already underway. Institutions continue operating. Long after their purpose has faded, systems respond mechanically, without producing meaningful outcomes. Empire still exists, but it no longer adapts. This is when external shocks become decisive, not because they are unprecedented, but because the system cannot absorb them. What once would have been manageable now overwhelms capacity. Responses are slow. Coordination fails. Trust collapses. From the outside, collapse appears sudden. From the inside, it feels inevitable, not because it was predicted, but because alternatives quietly disappeared. This is why history feels repetitive, not because humans fail to learn, but because power resists learning when learning threatens. Identity. Every empire believes it is different until the moment it is not. And that moment never arrives as revelation. It arrives as administration. As restructuring, as emergency measures, as temporary solutions. Until the temporary becomes permanent, and permanence becomes fragility. This is the final pattern. Power does not collapse when it is weak. Collapses when it is certain. Certain that it understands itself. Certain that it controls outcomes. Certain that history no longer applies. This certainty has never protected any empire. It has ended all of them, because power does not evolve. It does not reflect. It repeats. And every empire believes it will be the one that escapes the pattern. None ever do.